The signal did not arrive, it crashed. That was the word the analysts used when they replayed it for the third time in the deep monitoring station. Above Titan, not received, not detected, crashed, like something thrown from a very great height by something that no longer had the patience for gentleness. Commander Yara Ose was 41 years old, had spent 19 of those years in deep space communications, and had heard a lot of strange things come across the void. Pulsar rhythms that sounded like breathing, gravitational echoes from dead stars that almost resolved into patterns. She had never once believed any of it was anything other than physics doing what physics does. She believed this was different in the first 4 seconds of listening. The signal was not in any language humanity knew. That part was expected. What was not expected was that it took the translation AI less than 6 minutes to crack the base structure. Not because the language was simple, because it was desperate. Desperation, it turned out, had a universal grammar. Short bursts, repetition, the same clusters hammered over and over like a fist on a locked door. Come, they are here, come. Below that, under the surface layer that the AI peeled back like skin, was the real message, the one that took 3 days to fully render, and another 2 days for the senior xenolinguistics team to accept as accurate, because accepting it meant accepting things that broke the comfortable story humanity had been telling itself since it first looked up at the sky and wondered if anyone was looking back. The message was from something called the Conclave, a coalition, that much translated cleanly, of 61 spacefaring civilizations spread across what humans had been calling the Orion Spur. Some of them were thousands of years old. Some had faster-than-light travel that made humanity's best drives look like a child's paper boat in a bathtub. Some of them had weapons platforms the size of small moons. All 61 of them were losing. Not losing a war, not losing a campaign. Losing in the way that a candle loses to a room full of dark. Losing the way a sentence loses when someone erases it. Being unmade. That was the word the translation team settled on after arguing about it for 6 hours. Because the original term in the signal's base language did not mean destroyed or killed or defeated. It meant something closer to the idea of a thing being removed from the possibility of having ever existed. The Conclave was not asking for help. The Conclave was screaming for it. Yara stood in front of the Joint Space Command review board 4 days later and did not waste time on preamble. She put the signal's core data on the main display and said, "They have been fighting this thing for 200 years. Before that, it was someone else fighting it for 400 years. Before that, someone else. The oldest record we've been able to pull from the signal's attached data cache goes back approximately 2 million years. It has never stopped. It has never negotiated. It has never retreated. Every civilization that encountered it is either part of the Conclave and still running, or gone." The board was quiet. General Marcus Webb, who commanded Earth's Third Fleet and was not a man who went quiet easily, said, "What is it?" "They call it the Silence," Yara said. "Our best translation. Their term is longer. It's more like the thing that answers existence with nothing. We shortened it. And they're calling us because we're the only ones they haven't asked yet." She paused. "Let that land. Every other species in this region of the galaxy is already in the Conclave, or already gone. We are the last door they haven't knocked on." Webb leaned forward. He had the kind of face that had made a lot of hard decisions and showed every one of them. Why would they think we could help when 61 civilizations with technology that eats ours for breakfast are losing? Yara had been waiting for that question. She pulled up the secondary analysis her team had buried in the report, the piece that had kept her awake for 3 nights straight, not out of fear, but out of something she could not quite name. Something between pride and vertigo. Because, she said, buried in the data cache alongside their distress call was an observation report about us. They've been watching humanity for approximately 300 years. She clicked to the relevant section. They watched us fight each other. 2 world wars, dozens of smaller ones, the colonial period, the resource conflicts of the 22nd century, the Mars secession. She let the list sit there on the screen. "They are not calling us because they think we're powerful," she said. "They're calling us because in 300 years of observation they have never once seen humanity stop." The decision took 11 days. Later, historians would argue it should have taken longer. Should have involved more voices, more debate, more of the careful institutional machinery that humanity had spent 2 centuries building precisely for moments like this. It took 11 days because the Conclave signal had included one additional piece of data that the review board did not release to the public for another 6 months, a count updated as best they could tell in near real time by something in the signal's carrier structure, a count of stars. Specifically, a count of stars that had gone dark since the Silence began its current push. Stars that had not exploded, not aged out, not done anything that physics could account for. Stars that were simply, without drama or warning, no longer producing light. In 200 years of the current campaign, the silence had darkened 412 stars. In the 11 days between the signal's arrival and the board's decision, 7 more went out. Yara watched the number change on the second morning, and did not sleep again until the fleet was moving. The UES Adamant was not the largest ship in Earth's fleet. That distinction belonged to the dreadnought Cape of Good Hope, a vessel so massive it required its own dedicated power grid and had a crew of 11,000. The Adamant was a command carrier, smaller, faster, built around the idea that the most important thing a flagship could do in an unknown engagement was survive long enough to learn something. Captain Dara Singh had commanded it for 3 years. She was the kind of officer who read the maintenance logs herself and knew the name of every engineer in her deck crews. She was also, her first officer had once observed, constitutionally incapable of being frightened by anything she could point a gun at. She stood on the bridge as the fleet assembled around her. 47 warships, 3 carrier groups, 2 resupply chains, and a science vessel called the Perihelion that the Admiralty had insisted on, including because whatever they were flying toward, they needed to understand it, and watch the coordinated jump calculations resolve on the navigation display. 47 ships, Earth's largest single military deployment since the Mars secession. She had read the Conclave's data cache in full, all of it. The historical records, the tactical reports, the biological surveys of species that no longer existed. She had read the observations about humanity. The part Yara's team had translated as the reason the Conclave chose to call them, and sat with it in her quarters for a long time. They do not stop, the Conclave's observer had written, in their alien grammar that the translation AI rendered in flat, careful English. When they lose a battle, they study it and return. When they lose a war, they rebuild and return. We have watched them be beaten, broken, scattered, and silenced, and each time the silence does not hold, they return. We do not understand it. We do not know if it is courage or damage. But we believe that against the thing we face, it does not matter. We need something that does not stop. Singh had read that 3 times. Then she had gone to the bridge and begun preparations. The jump coordinates the Conclave had provided put them at the edge of a system with no name in any human catalog. The Conclave called it a waypoint, a meeting place, neutral, far enough from the current front lines to allow for a conversation before the shooting started again. The fleet dropped out of FTL in formation, standard combat spread, shields up, weapons hot, because Singh had not spent 20 years in deep space to arrive at a first contact with 61 alien civilizations and lower her guard. What met them was not what any of them expected, not a fleet, not a battle, not the gleaming, vast, technologically incomprehensible armada that the intelligence reports had suggested the Conclave could field. What met them was wreckage, ship after ship tumbling in the dark, hulls sheared open, drive cores cold, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, spread across a debris field that stretched beyond sensor range in 3 directions. The design of the ships was foreign, curved and organic where human ships were angular, built around principles that the Perihelion science team would spend months trying to reverse engineer. But the damage was legible, universal. Something had torn through here, recently. The metal was still warm. Contact, said the sensor officer, her voice stripped to pure function. Single vessel, bearing 27 Mark 9. She stopped, report, Singh said. It's moving, Captain, one of the wrecked ships. It's moving under power. A pause. They're hailing us. The communication that came through was not translated by the AI, it was in English. Broken, accented, clearly learned rather than native, but English. Whoever was on the other end of that signal had been preparing for this conversation for a long time. Human ships. The voice was layered. Not one voice, but many, slightly offset like a chord played on an instrument with too many strings. You are late. We are grateful anyway. A sound that might have been a breath or might have been something else entirely. We must speak quickly. The silence tracked our signal. It knows you are here now. Singh looked at her tactical display, at the wreckage field, at the single ship still burning in the dark, at the count of darkened stars updating even now in the corner of her screen. We're listening, she said. The ship that limped toward them through the wreckage was called the Undying Patience, which the translation AI rendered with a footnote noting that the original word for patience in the Conclave's trade tongue carried a secondary, meaning closer to the act of outlasting something that wants you dead. It was about twice the size of the adamant, teardrop-shaped, and it had a hole through its midsection large enough to dock a shuttle through. It was running on what the Perihelion chief engineer described, in a voice that went slightly flat with disbelief, as something that should not be keeping it pressurized. The being that came aboard to speak with Singh called itself an ambassador. It did not give another name. It stood approximately 9 feet tall, moved like something that had evolved in low gravity and never quite adjusted to the standard kind, and had 4 arms arranged in 2 pairs at different heights on its torso. Its face was a cluster of sensory organs that human neurology refused to resolve into anything familiar. It wore what appeared to be a garment made of material that shifted colors slowly, like oil on water, though the science team later determined it was not fabric at all, but a kind of living membrane that regulated the ambassador's body temperature. It sat across the conference table from Singh Webb, who had come aboard the XLU Adamant specifically for this meeting, and 3 other senior officers, and it spoke in its layered, too-many-strings voice, and it told them everything. The silence was not a species. That was the first thing. The thing that made the room go very still. It had been built 2 million years ago by a civilization whose name had been lost so completely that even the Conclave's oldest records contained only a symbol for it, a circle with line through the center, which the Conclave's historians had been arguing about for centuries. Some said it meant first. Some said it meant ended. Some said both. This civilization, the Circle People, Webb's notes called them, because he was a practical man who needed to call things something, had built the silence as a weapon. This was not unusual. Many civilizations built weapons. The difference was the scale of the ambition. The Circle People had been losing a war, not the silence's war. Their own war against another civilization, also now gone, also now a symbol in someone else's archive. They had been losing badly, and so they had done what desperate, brilliant, frightened minds do when their backs are against the final wall. They had built something that could not lose, not would not, could not. The silence was not designed to win battles. It was designed to make battle irrelevant, to approach a star system, assess every piece of technology that could be used against it, learn how that technology worked, and then adapt until that technology could not harm it. Then move to the next system, assess, adapt, move, and then, because the Circle People had been thorough, there was the secondary directive. The one that had outlasted the war, outlasted the Circle People, outlasted the civilization they had been fighting, outlasted everything. If a civilization develops the capacity to threaten the silence does not simply adapt, it removes that civilization from the equation entirely, star and all. The 412 darkened stars were not casualties of battle. They were threat assessments that had been resolved. 2 million years, Webb said. Not a question, just the number repeated because saying it aloud was the only way to start making it real. 2 million years, the ambassador confirmed. It began with the war it was built for. Both sides were destroyed within 4 centuries of its creation. The silence had no directive to stop. It had only the directive to continue. And no one in 2 million years has been able to stop it, Singh said. Many have slowed it. The Conclave has held its front line for 200 years. This is, you must understand, unprecedented. Before us, the record was 40 years. A pause that felt like grief wearing the shape of information. We are very good at war. Most species in this spur achieved spaceflight through competition and conflict. We have weapons that can crack planetary crusts. We have point defense grids that can intercept attacks moving at a significant fraction of light speed. We have admirals who have been fighting this specific enemy for their entire lifetimes. And you're still losing, Singh said. We are still losing, the ambassador agreed, because the silence learns. Every weapon we use it studies. Every tactic it catalogs. Every innovation it absorbs and defends against. We have given it 200 years of education. It is better at fighting us than we are at fighting it. Every year that passes, the gap widens. Singh looked at the tactical display built into the conference table's surface. The wreckage field outside was still pinging on sensors. Hundreds of ships, hundreds, gone before the Adamant content had even arrived. What happened here, she asked. At this waypoint, we had a fleet here, a holding force to secure the meeting point. The silence found it 4 hours before you arrived. The ambassador's sensory cluster oriented toward the display. 11,000 ships, some of the finest crews in the Conclave. Webb said nothing. The number sat in the room. They fought well, the ambassador said. They bought you the time to arrive. The briefing that followed lasted 6 hours. The ambassador's people, other survivors from the undying patience, slowly filtering aboard the Adamant. In small groups, each of them moving with the specific kind of careful that people move when they have been very recently in a place where many others died, provided data files, tactical records, and the most complete intelligence picture of the silence that any living civilization possessed. It was thorough, it was detailed, it was in the assessment of the perihelion. His science team, working at frantic speed to process the incoming data, the most comprehensive enemy profile ever assembled. It was also as Lieutenant Commander Jong Min-jun from the Adamant's tactical division observed privately to Singh during a break, terrifying in a specific and particular way that had nothing to do with the silence, size or power. "It's not the weapons that bother me," he said. They were standing in the narrow corridor outside the conference room, both holding coffee, both looking at nothing. "We've got bigger weapons than we thought. The Conclave has bigger weapons still. That part I can deal with." "What's bothering you?" Singh said. "The pattern." He set his coffee down on the corridor railing. "Every civilization that slowed it down. You look at the data, they all did it the same way. New technology, new approach, something the silence hadn't seen before. It worked for a while, months, sometimes years. Then the silence adapted and came back harder." He picked up his coffee again. Every new idea just made it smarter. Singh had noticed the same thing, had been sitting with it for 3 hours. "So the question," she said, "is whether we have something new enough to matter. The question," Min-jun said, "is whether anything new is actually what we need." That night, ship's night. Adamant's internal clock cycling through its artificial dark. Singh sat in her quarters with the full data file and read it end to end, not the summary, the raw record. 2 million years of civilizations rising and falling and fighting and failing, compressed into file sizes her terminal could barely process. She read about the Veth, who had built a weapon that disrupted the silence's communication between its component parts, and had 17 glorious years of victories before. The silence simply stopped needing to communicate between its parts. She read about the Conshir, who had found a way to collapse FTL corridors and trapped a significant portion of the silence in a region of space so isolated it took the silence 40 years to dig out, which gave the Conshir 40 years of peace and the certainty that when the silence returned, it would be angrier and more complete than before. She read about the Conclave's own innovations, 47 of them, 47 new approaches in 200 years, each one buying time, each one eventually absorbed, each one adding to the silence's growing catalog of how to be unopposable. She closed the file at 0300 and sat in the dark. The Conclave had called humanity, not because humanity had better weapons, not because humanity had smarter scientists or more creative engineers or more powerful drives. They had called humanity because of the observation, the 300 years of watching, the word that translated as, "They do not stop." Singh understood now why that had looked like an asset to the Conclave. She also understood why it might not be enough. The silence arrived at the edge of the system at 0611. Not the whole of it. Later analysis suggested this was a fraction, a scouting element, a tendril extended to probe the new variables the signal had introduced into its models. But a fraction of the silence was still a thing that made the Adamant sensor station light up across every board simultaneously, and the tactical AI emit a sound it had never made before. A low, sustained tone that the design notes called a mass contact alarm, and that sounded, in the moment, less like an alarm and more like a held breath. It was enormous. Not ships exactly. The classification systems that humanity had built for space combat were full of clean categories: fighter, cruiser, destroyer, dreadnought, and the silence fit none of them. It was more like a structure, a moving structure, interconnected, the individual elements shifting and reconfiguring, even as the sensors tried to resolve them into discrete units. It breathed, or something that looked enough like breathing that the word attached itself and would not let go. And it was watching them, not attacking, watching. The way something watches when it is deciding whether you are worth the data. "All ships," Singh said, her voice flat and clear and carrying everything she needed it to carry, battle stations. Then she opened a channel to the undying patience, where the ambassador was still resting after 6 hours of briefing. "Ambassador," she said, "you need to see this." There was a long pause. When the ambassador responded, the layered voice had something in it that Singh had not heard before. She did not have a word for it in English. Later the translation AI would flag it and suggest the closest approximation. The suggestion was, "The feeling of recognizing something you hoped you would never see again." "Yes," the ambassador said, "we do." The first thing the silence did was nothing. This, the ambassador explained, was bad. When it observes without acting, it is building a model, it said. They were on the bridge now. All pretense of a formal briefing location abandoned in favor of wherever the screens were. It is calculating the most efficient path to your removal. It may take minutes, it may take days. When it finishes, it will not hesitate. "How do we know when it's finished?" Singh asked. "You will know," the ambassador said, "because it will start." The silence hung at the edge of the system like a thought that had not yet become a word. The sensors tracked it constantly. It did not move closer. It did not move away. It simply existed out there in the dark and watched humanity's 47-ship fleet with the patient, comprehensive attention of something that had been doing this for 2 million years and found waiting entirely comfortable. Singh spent 40 minutes watching it. Then she turned to Minjun. "I want every piece of combat data we have from the past 300 years," she said. "Every war we've fought, every conflict on record." Minjun blinked against the silence, against each other. The Conclave had given them 6 data files on the Silence's tactical behavior, detailed, precise, and, in the opinion of the Adamant's tactical team, almost certainly incomplete because the Conclave was still learning as they briefed. But Singh was not looking at those files. She had pulled up humanity's own records, not because she had a plan, because Minjun's words from the corridor were still in her head. Every new idea just made it smarter. And she was trying to find the thread in her own civilization's history that the Conclave had seen from 300 years away. The wars were ugly. They were always ugly close up. The resource conflicts of the 22nd century had been particularly bad, 3-sided, badly supplied, running on desperation and ideology in equal parts, the kind of war that historians later had trouble explaining because the logic of it was so circular it almost ate itself. The side that eventually won had not won by being better armed or better funded. They had won by changing what they were fighting for in the middle of the war, not the goal, the frame, the thing the soldiers told themselves every morning about what they were doing and why it mattered. Halfway through a losing campaign, their general, a small, unremarkable woman named Abioi who had spent most of the conflict surviving things that should have killed her, had stood in front of her remaining forces and told them to stop thinking about winning. "Stop thinking about winning," she had said, according to the record. "We are not trying to win. We are trying to still be here. Those are different problems." The campaign that followed was not elegant. It was not a brilliant tactical reversal. It was stubborn, costly, improvised, and deeply weird in ways that military theorists still argued about. It worked because the other side kept expecting Abioi's forces to behave like an army that was trying to win, and Abioi's forces kept behaving like something that was simply refusing to stop existing. Singh closed that file, opened another. The Mars secession, the Jovian blockades, the asteroid belt skirmishes of the 2190s, different conflicts, different centuries, different technologies, and running through all of them like a wire, the same pattern. The same thing the Conclave had watched from their deep space observatories and circled in their reports and flagged and discussed, and eventually, 200 years into their own losing war, decided might be worth importing. Humanity did not fight to win. Humanity fought because stopping had never, at any point in its history, seemed like an option it was capable of choosing. The Silence adapted to strategies, to technologies, to innovations. The question was whether it could adapt to something that was not a strategy at all. She called the command meeting at 0900 and put Abioi's record on the screen without context. The captains of the other 46 ships were present via holographic relay, their faces arranged in a grid that filled half the bridge. Behind some of them, Singh could see their own bridge, their own crew. The quiet, controlled tension of people who had been watching something vast and patient and terrible sit at the edge of their sensors for 3 hours. She let them read the record. Then she said, "The Silence has beaten every civilization that tried to outthink it. It learned every weapon, absorbed every tactic, adapted to every innovation. It is smarter than any single mind and older than most civilizations. We cannot outthink it." No one said anything, which was the right response. "But the Conclave didn't call us because they thought we were the smartest people in the galaxy," Singh said. "They called us because in 300 years of watching us, they never saw us decide that losing meant stopping." She pulled up the tactical display, the Silence on one side of the system, the fleet on the other, the math of it, tonnage, firepower. The Conclave's technical assessments of the Silence's current adaptive state was not favorable, not remotely. "We are not going to defeat the Silence today," she said. "I want to be clear about that. We are also not going to die today. What we are going to do is make contact with it, actual combat contact, and make sure that when it builds its model of us, it builds and beyond. Accurate." 1. Captain Voss, commanding the Dreadnought, Cape of Good Hope, said, "You want to let it study us." "I wanted to study something true," Singh said, "because every other civilization gave it the best of what they had. Their finest weapons, their cleverest tactics, their most advanced technology, and the Silence learned those things and moved on." She looked at the grid of faces. "We are going to show it something it has never cataloged. We are going to show it something that doesn't have an upper limit to adapt to." The ambassador, standing to one side of the bridge where it had been silent since the meeting began, spoke. "What is that?" Singh looked at it. "We're going to show it that we don't care how good it gets," she said, because getting better was never the point. The first contact was at 11:47. The silence moved when it was ready, not when provoked, not in response to anything the fleet did. It simply decided it had enough information and began. What it sent first was not a weapon, it was a probe, a fragment of itself, an appendage of that vast interlocked structure, separated and directed toward the fleet, with the smooth efficiency of something that had done exactly this thing countless thousands of times. The probe was roughly the size of a heavy cruiser. It was not shaped like anything. It was a collection of components and geometries that the Silence had found useful in varying combinations over 2 million years, and was currently assembling in a configuration calibrated for maximum threat assessment of unknown variables. The fleet had been briefed on this. The ambassador had described the probing methodology in the data files. Every conclave captain who had ever seen this moment had a version of the same memory, the probe coming in, the exchange of fire, the probe absorbing and noting and retreating, and the Silence building a slightly more complete picture before sending the next wave. What the Silence had not seen, in 2 million years of probing, was 47 ships that stopped moving, not stopped firing, not stopped fighting, stopped fleeing. Standard doctrine, human, conclave, any civilization that had engaged the Silence and taken notes for posterity, called for the receiving fleet to engage and then fall back, draw the exchange out, gather data. Avoid getting too much of your force too close to something the Silence hadn't finished modeling yet. Singh held the fleet in position. The probe reached effective weapons range and opened fire. And Adamantid took a hit on the port flank that blew out 2 shield generators and vented a section of the secondary hull. Minjun reported it in a flat voice. Singh said, "Return fire all ships, do not break formation." The tactical AI flagged this as contrary to doctrine. Singh turned the flag off. The exchange lasted 9 minutes. The probe took hits from 47 ships simultaneously, a wall of fire it had not anticipated because no fleet, in its catalogued history, had chosen to concentrate force at the cost of maneuverability. It absorbed the hits, adapted in real time, its exterior composition shifting in ways the perihelion. Science team watched with horrified fascination, but it had not finished adapting when the fleet hit it again, and again, and again, not with anything new, not with any innovation. The same weapons, the same angles, the same sustained and completely unrelenting pressure. The probe retreated at the 9-minute mark. Adamant. His bridge was quiet. The damage reports came in. 4 ships had taken significant hits. None were destroyed, the ambassador said very quietly. It retreated. It needed to recalibrate, Minjun said. He was reading his screens with an expression that Singh couldn't quite interpret. It's seen weapons adapt to it before. It hasn't seen a force that just kept going after they stopped doing damage. Because no one has ever done that, the ambassador said. When a weapon stops being effective, you change the weapon. That is strategy. That is logic. Sure, Singh said. She was watching the Silence reform at the edge of the system. We've also got a pretty strong cultural tradition of hitting things that aren't hurting them anymore, just because stopping feels like losing. She paused. Turns out that's useful. The Silence did not attack again that day. It sat at the edge of the system and, Singh was increasingly convinced, thought very hard about what had just happened, not in the way a person thinks, in the way a machine built for 2 million years of adaptation thinks, with the whole of its vast, distributed, interconnected intelligence turned toward a new data set and the problem of what to do with it. The conclave forces, brought up to speed on the engagement via the dying patient's communication system, sent back a response that the translation AI rendered as a mixture of confusion, hope, and something that did not translate cleanly, but that one of the linguists privately described as the feeling of watching someone do something you thought was impossible simply because they didn't know it was impossible. The ambassador stood beside Singh at the observation window, looking out at the dark, and was quiet for a long time. Then it said, "Our observers were right." Singh looked at it. "They wrote that they did not know if it was courage or damage," the ambassador said. "What they saw in 300 years of watching you." It turned its sensory cluster toward her, and Singh had the strange feeling of being looked at by something that had seen civilization's end, and was genuinely uncertain what it was seeing now. "I think now that it does not matter." Singh turned back to the window. The Silence was still out there, still thinking, still building its model. "No," she said, "it doesn't." The Silence came back on the 3rd day with everything, not a probe, not an assessment, the full weight of what it had committed to this region of space. The structure Singh had first seen on sensors, the breathing, reconfiguring, vast and terrible thing that had darkened 419 stars. came in from the edge of the system in a movement that the tactical AI described as a coordinated advance before running out of appropriate military vocabulary and simply generating a trajectory map that showed every ship in the fleet how little time they had. 22 minutes, all captains, Singh said. I need 60 seconds of silence. She got it. The channel open, 46 ships listening, and Singh stood at the center of it and understood very clearly what she was looking at, what the conclave had been looking at for 200 years. What every civilization that had seen this and survived long enough to write it down had understood in the moments before it arrived. It was not just big, it was complete. That was the word for it. The Silence had spent 2 million years becoming the most efficient engine of removal ever constructed, and looking at its full advance on the tactical display was like looking at a proof. A mathematical certainty in the shape of something that moved. She thought about Abioy, small, unremarkable, standing in front of what remained of her forces and telling them to stop trying to win. We are not trying to win, Singh said into the channel. I want everyone to be clear about that. We are trying to still be here when this is over. And we are going to do that by being the most expensive thing it has ever tried to remove. A pause. Every ship, every captain, every crew member. Your job is not to destroy it. Your job is to cost it more than it has ever been cost in 2 million years. Make yourself the hardest thing it has ever eaten. Make it work. For every centimeter, Voss on the Cape of Good Hope said, and if it adapt to everything we throw at it, then we throw the same things again, Singh said. Twice as many times. The battle, when it began, was not what any of them expected. It was not clean. It was not elegant. It was not the kind of engagement that's written up in academy textbooks because the tactics were brilliant or the maneuvers were beautiful. It was a fight. The Silence hit the fleet's forward line first, a concentrated push that was clearly designed to dismantle the formation, scatter the ships, isolate them, and then address each one individually. Every civilization it had fought had broken formation under this kind of pressure. The math was straightforward. A scattered fleet fought at a fraction of its concentrated power, and a fleet fighting at a fraction of its power was a fleet the Silence could learn. From one piece at a time. Adamant. Forward shields failed in the first 3 minutes. The port side of the ship opened to vacuum in 6 places. Damage control teams moved through corridors with emergency suits and patch systems and the furious, competent speed of people who had trained for exactly this, and were discovering that training and the real thing are different in every way that matters and the same in the one way that counts. The formation did not break. This was not an order Singh had to repeat. The captains had understood the briefing. More than understood it. They had looked at the conclave's 200 years of records and seen what breaking formation bought you, which was more time to die in smaller pieces, and had collectively decided that more time was not actually the goal. Being here was the goal. Staying in contact, making the Silence's math not work out. 3 ships were destroyed in the first hour. The Kalahari, the Pendragon, and a frigate called the Yangui. Constant. Singh received each report with the specific weight that comes from knowing names, not just hull numbers, not just tonnage and capability assessments, but the names, and behind the names the faces of briefings and pre-deployment reviews and the mundane machinery of command that links commanders to crews, and set each one down in the part of herself that was keeping a separate account. Later. That was the agreement she made with herself. She would feel all of it later, when there was time. The Constant had a crew of 240. Katsulahari. 800, the 400 and some. Later, what the Silence could not account for was not the weapons. It adapted to the weapons on a rolling basis, its outer structure shifting and reconfiguring in real time as the fleet's fire found new angles and new combinations. It was extraordinary to watch, even in the middle of trying to survive it. The Perihelion. His science team was running full sensor analysis throughout the battle because the order was everything we learn matters, and we are going to survive long enough to use it. And the data they were capturing was unprecedented. The Silence learning, in real time. The individual components of it, communicating and updating and distributing new adaptive patterns at speeds that made human neural processing look geological. It was a marvel. It was also losing ground, not because it couldn't adapt to what the fleet was doing. It could. It was adapting constantly. The problem, and this was a problem that the Silence, built for 2 million years of engagements that followed the same broad pattern, had no ready framework for, was that the fleet kept doing the things it had already adapted to. Every other civilization, when the Silence adapted to a weapon, changed the weapon. introduced something new, gave the Silence a new problem to solve. The Silence had grown extraordinarily good at this process. It was faster at adapting than any civilization was at innovating. The Adamant fleet kept firing the same things, at the same points, at the same frequencies. When the Silence's outer structure reconfigured to defend against a particular type of energy discharge, the fleet hit it with that exact same discharge again and again, not because it was still effective. It wasn't, or at least not as effective, but because there was another calculation in play that the Silence had not needed to make for 2 million years. The fleet was not trying to destroy it. The fleet was trying to not stop, and not stopping cost it something too. Every reconfiguration took energy. Every adaptation redistributed resources through the Silence's interconnected system. Adapting to a new weapon was efficient. Adapting to a weapon that should have been abandoned and wasn't, that kept demanding attention, kept requiring maintenance of the new configuration, even after the tactical logic for it had passed. That was a different problem. Not devastating, but present. A low constant drain on a system that had been optimized for enemies that behaved rationally. The Conclave forces, watching via the undying patience, his relay, began reporting something they had not reported in 200 years. The Silence was slowing down. It was the ambassador who came to Singh in the middle of the 5th hour with the analysis. The battle was still running. The bridge was running on its 3rd hour of continuous red alert. Half the consoles showing damage reports alongside tactical feeds. The smell of burnt circuitry sitting in the recycled air, and the ambassador made its way through it all with careful steps and laid a data slate on the edge of Singh's console. Our scientists, it said, have been correlating your engagement data with our 200 years of records. Singh glanced at it without taking her eyes off the tactical display. Tell me. The Silence has adapted to your weapons 4 times in the last hour. Each adaptation cycle has taken 8% longer than the previous one. The ambassador's layered voice was doing something Singh was starting to recognize as the alien equivalent of careful excitement, the kind of voice you use when you are afraid of hoping too much. It is not a large difference, but it is a consistent one, and in 200 years of our engagements, we have never once recorded a lengthening of adaptation cycles, only shortening. Singh was quiet for a moment. The tactical display showed the Silence still pressing, still enormous, still adapting in real time to everything the fleet put out. It's getting tired, Minjun said from tactical. He had heard the briefing. His voice had the flat quality of someone choosing not to let themselves feel the implications yet. It cannot tire in the way you mean, the ambassador said. It is a machine, it does not have fatigue. But it's burning resources it can't replenish as fast as we're spending them, Minjun said. That's the same thing from a certain angle. The ambassador was quiet. We did not think of it that way, it said, finally. In 200 years, we were always trying to find the new thing, the innovation it couldn't adapt to, a pause. We never tried simply spending it faster than it could replenish. We didn't either, Singh said. We just didn't know how to do anything else. The 6th hour was the hardest. The Silence, perhaps recognizing something in the pattern it was being given, changed its own approach. It pulled back from the distributed pressure it had been running and concentrated, not adapting to the fleet's weapons, focusing on removal, choosing targets by vulnerability, and hitting them with a sustained attention that was, if the word could be applied to a machine, almost personal. The Cape of Good Hope took a hit that destroyed its main drive and 2/3 of its weapons capacity in a single strike. Voss's voice on the channel was steady and reported the damage with the efficient calm of someone who had decided long ago that steady and efficient was the only thing the situation allowed. She reported that they were still operational, still in formation. Idun was destroyed. The Orisanmi was destroyed. A destroyer called the 76 was hit so badly that its captain ordered evacuation, and then, when the evacuation couldn't complete, went back to weapons active and kept firing until there was nothing left to fire from. Later, still later, the account was getting heavy. The 7th hour, the Silence pulled back, not retreating. Singh was careful with the word, careful not to want it too much because wanting things too much in combat was the way you made mistakes. But it was not advancing. The pressure had lessened. The sustained concentration attacks had stopped. The Silence was, as far as the sensors could read, simply sitting, rebuilding, redistributing, running its adaptation cycles. Damage report, Singh said. Minjun gave it to her. 9 ships destroyed. 14 ships with major damage. 11 ships with minor damage. Cape of Good Hope was functionally a weapons platform at this point rather than a warship. But Voss reported weapons still operational and had no intention of leaving formation. The Adamant had taken hits in 4 engagements and was still running on about 60% of its original capability. 24 ships still fully combat capable. The silence outside was an unknown quantity, but the adaptation cycle data the ambassador had laid on the slate was still updating, and the lengthening trend had not reversed. We heard it, Minjun said. We caused it, Singh said. Whether we heard it is a different question. She opened the fleet-wide channel again. Let them hear her voice, steady, the same voice she had been using for 7 hours. The voice that said, "The situation is what it is and we are still here, and those 2 facts matter. All ships, 7 hours, 9 lost. We are still in formation and the enemy has pulled back." She paused. This is not a victory. This is the beginning of what a victory might look like if we keep doing exactly what we've been doing. Another pause. Rest who you can. Repair what you can. The silence will come back. When it does, we will still be here. The channel was quiet for a moment. Then Voss, from the crippled Cape of Good Hope, said, "Understood. Adamant." And one by one, the other captains answered, "Still here, still here, still here." The silence came back on the 10th day. In the 3 days between, humanity fixed what could be fixed and recorded what could not be. Perihelion. Science team did not sleep in any meaningful sense. They took the battle data and the adaptation cycle analysis and 200 years of conclave records and built a model of the silence's resource expenditure that made the Adamant chief engineer, a steady and unflappable woman named Dr. Priya Nair, sit down in the middle of the lab and stare at her hands for a while. The model said this: the silence, over the course of the 7-hour engagement, had spent resources it would normally have spent in 3 weeks of continuous operation. The adaptation to novel threats process, running continuously against an enemy that refused to change its approach, had burned through reserves at a rate the silence's own architecture had not been designed to sustain. It was not going to run out. Nobody was saying that. The silence was 2 million years old and distributed across a region of space too large to accurately measure from their position. It had reserves that were, by any reasonable calculation, effectively limitless, but it was burning them, and the irate Perihelion's model, cross-referenced with the Conclave's 2 centuries of engagement data, suggested that the silence had never, in all of its recorded history, burned resources this fast against a single fleet. Because no fleet ever made it work this hard to achieve so little, said Dr. Yusuf Okafor, the science team's lead analyst, who had been awake for 60 hours and had the specific look of someone who had passed exhaustion and come out somewhere else entirely. It adapted 4 times in 7 hours and we were still there at the end. Every previous engagement, 4 adaptations meant the fight was over. The adapting civilization had changed its approach 4 times. The silence had learned 4 new things. And the engagement ended because the civilization had nothing left to give it that it hadn't already consumed. He put the model on the main screen. We gave it nothing new and it still couldn't finish the job. The Conclave communicated during those 3 days in a way they had apparently not communicated in the Conclave's entire 200-year existence, at volume. Transmissions from Conclave member species came in from across the region in a flood that overwhelmed the undying patience. Desk communications array and had to be routed through the Adamant his own systems. Most of the messages were in the Conclave's trade language and took time to translate, but the emotional register needed no translation. Even the ambassador, reading the incoming communications with its sensory cluster moving in a pattern Singh had learned to associate with intense focus, seemed briefly and unexpectedly moved. They want to know, it said, if what we told them is accurate, that the silence retreated. Pulled back, Singh corrected. Not the same thing. I know. The ambassador set down the translation slate. To us, however, after 200 years, the distinction may be difficult to maintain in the emotional sense. Singh understood that. She also understood that the Conclave fleet, or what remained of the Conclave fleet, had spent 200 years fighting something it believed could not be worn down, could not be pressured, could not be made to pay more than it chose to pay for any engagement. The idea that there was an approach that changed that calculation, even slightly, even provisionally, was the kind of information that could rebuild the way 61 civilizations understood the war they were fighting. She sent a reply to the Conclave that she spent 2 hours drafting and had Minjun and the ambassador review for accuracy. It said, the silence had pulled back. It said, the engagement data was being transmitted in full. It said, the approach humanity had used was not a new technology or a novel weapon, but a behavioral pattern, and that pattern was replicable. It said, at the end carefully and with all the qualifications the situation warranted. This is not over and it is not won. But the model has changed. The silence came back on the 10th day, and it came back differently. This was what the perihelion its team had feared and the ambassador had been waiting for. The silence was not static. It had spent 2 million years getting better at what it did, and what it had spent the intervening 3 days doing was precisely the same work it always did, cataloging a new variable and calculating an appropriate response. What it came back with was a configuration the Conclave had never seen. The outer structure was different. The movement pattern was different. The approach was not the concentrated push of the 7th hour, but something more distributed, designed not to overwhelm and remove but to attrite, to find the weaknesses in a formation that wouldn't break and apply sustained, targeted pressure to the specific points that would make not breaking cost more than the formation could bear. It had looked at humanity and concluded, correctly, that brute force was inefficient. It had adapted. Singh had expected this. All captains, she said. It changed its approach, so we change ours. She put the tactical overlay on the fleet channel, not the tactics, not the weapons. The formation, new configuration on my mark. The Conclave's ambassador listening said, it will adapt to the new configuration. Yes, Singh said. Then we change it again, and it will adapt to that as well. Yes, and we'll change it again. A pause. This seems inefficient. It is. Singh was watching the silence advance on the tactical display. But it means every time it adapts, it's adapting to something we've changed on purpose. We control the pace of what it has to learn. We decide when it gets new information and when it gets the same information again. She marked the fleet's new configuration and sent the command. Ships moved across the display, smooth and coordinated. We're not trying to trick it. We're just trying to make sure it never has a chance to feel finished. The silence reached engagement range, and the battle began again. The second engagement lasted 14 hours. The fleet lost 6 ships, 11 more were damaged. Cape of Good Hope, already badly mauled, took another hit that destroyed its last weapons cluster. Voss ordered her crew to continue running interference, to stay in the formation and occupy the attention of any silence component that came within. Range, drawing fire, making the targeting calculations harder. A weapons platform made into a shield. Voss reported this calmly and did not ask for permission. Singh did not comment on it. The adaptation cycle data, tracked continuously by the perihelion, showed cycles lengthening again within the first 3 hours. Then, in the 9th hour, something that Dr. Okafor reported with a voice that had gone completely flat, a cycle that didn't complete. The silence had begun an adaptation to the fleet's 3rd configuration change, and had not finished it before the fleet changed again. It had not failed exactly. The silence did not fail in any conventional sense, but the incomplete adaptation sat in its system as an ongoing resource drain, never resolved, continuing to demand computational attention even as new adaptations stacked on top of it. By the 12th hour, there were 3 incomplete adaptation cycles running simultaneously. The silence's advance, previously smooth and continuous, had developed irregularities, small hesitations, moments where the structure held its position rather than pressing forward while something internally resolved. Minjin said from tactical, in a voice that had gone very quiet, Captain. It's stuttering. The silence withdrew at the 14th hour mark, not pulled back, withdrew. The distinction mattered because the tactical AI, tracking the movement, flagged it as the first time in any engagement for which the Conclave had data that the silence had changed course in a way that prioritized internal consolidation over tactical position. It was still vast, still present, still dangerous in ways that would require years and resources and lives to fully understand. But it withdrew to a distance that put it outside effective engagement range. And when it stopped moving, Dr. Okafor's monitoring data showed 4 simultaneous incomplete adaptation cycles still running. It was running maintenance. The undying patience. Its communications array, overwhelmed again, this time with something the translation AI rendered inconsistently. Triumph and terror and relief, blurred together in a way that suggested the Conclave's trade language had not developed separate words for them because, until now, they had never needed to occur simultaneously. Singh stood at the observation window and did not let herself feel anything yet. Later, still later. The account was very heavy now. The ambassador came to stand beside her. They were both quiet for a long time. It will return, the ambassador said. Yes, Singh said, better than before. The incomplete cycles will resolve. It will develop responses to everything we showed it today. When it comes back, it will be harder to do this again. Yes, Singh said, and we will need to fight it again, and again after that, for years, perhaps, decades. Singh said, and you knew this when you came here. Singh considered this. The window was full of dark and debris, and the distant cold light of stars that were still burning, and she stood in front of all of it and considered what the ambassador was really asking. "We knew we were coming to fight something that had never been beaten," she said. "We knew it was going to take everything we had and probably more. We knew some of our ships were going to die." She paused. None of that meant we should stay home. The ambassador was quiet for a moment. "Our observers wrote that they did not understand it," it said. "Courage or damage, their note." The layered voice was doing the thing again that Singh had no clean word for. "I think I understand it now. It is neither." Singh looked at it. "It is simply," the ambassador said, "that you appear to have decided at some point in your history that existing is not negotiable." The message that Earth received 3 months later had been written by 61 civilizations and took 11 hours to fully translate. It was longer than it needed to be by any technical standard, because it had been written by beings who had spent 200 years fighting a war they expected to lose and had needed to say more than the immediate facts required. It said, "The silence had not darkened a star in 93 days. It said, "The incomplete adaptation cycles had propagated through the silence's distributed system in a way the conclave's scientists were still analyzing, but whose effect was a measurable decrease in operational efficiency across the entire structure. Not dramatic, not decisive, but consistent and growing." It said, "We have changed our doctrine. We have stopped trying to innovate and started trying to persist." It said, "It is strange, learning from someone newer and smaller and less powerful than yourself." It said, "We are grateful." It said other things, in other languages, that took longer to translate, and that the linguist afterward described as some of the most complex emotional constructions they had ever encountered, packed with meaning that required entire paragraphs of English to approximate. The last section of the message, translated, finally by a junior linguist named Adeyes Ngozi, who had been working on it for 2 days and submitted her rendering with a note saying she was not certain it was accurate, but she was certain it was as close as language could get, said simply, "We have fought the thing that ends civilizations for 200 years, and we thought we understood what persistence looked like. We were wrong. Persistence is not fighting for a long time. Persistence is not remembering why you are fighting. Persistence is, as near as we can determine, a specific and slightly incomprehensible decision to treat stopping as something that happens to other people. You appear to have made this decision very early in your history and to have never revisited it. We are glad." Singh read the message in her quarters on the Adamant, which was still 3 weeks from Earth and in need of repairs that the dockyard crews were already being briefed on. The ship was quieter now than it had been. Some silences were about damage. Some were about the kind of recovery that happens in the weeks after something big and costly, when the immediate noise settles and what remains is the weight of what was spent. She thought about the 15 ships, the thousands of names in the roster she was carrying back to Earth. She thought about the silence, still out there, rebuilding, adapting. Eventually, inevitably, coming back with everything it had learned. Coming back harder than before. She thought about the conclave, 61 civilizations rewriting their doctrine, changing how they fought, learning something from the species they had called in as a last resort that they had apparently needed 200 years to learn. She thought about Abioye, small, unremarkable, standing in front of what remained of her army and telling them that winning wasn't the point. She thought about the star count, still updating, somewhere, on some screen. 419 the last time she had looked. It had not changed since the second engagement. She set down the message. She went back to work. There was a lot of it left.